Hello, welcome everyone to the opening of the first of 2 days of the International Conference, The Times of Pardon, Forgiveness, Theoretical Approaches, Practical Considerations at UCR Hispanic Studies. We are happy to have this opportunity to share with you, and we greatly appreciate the attendance both in person and remotely by one part of the speakers who are part of the wonderful panels that will take place in these 2 days, and on the other by those who have joined to this meeting to see and listen to the lectures and participate in the discussions. So now, without further ado, I give the pass to the moderator of the opening of the first conference of this first block, Paula Cucurella.
I should talk in that direction and look at where.
Yes.
That's the camera that's everything?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I just want to introduce Idoia Quintana, who is right by me. She is amazing. She is a doctor in philosophy from the University Complutense de Madrid and the Catholic University in Lovaina. She is currently a researcher doing a postdoc founded by the Marie Curie postdoc program fellowship. And she's doing it through UCR, this is why she is here, and also through the University of Deusto. Yes, that's an important name for me. So thank you very much, Idoia, and I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you. Bueno, tomo yo ahora la palabra en castellano, porque este va a ser un congreso un poco menos bilingüe, en más de una lengua. Y lo primero que quiero es reiterar la bienvenida y el agradecimiento a todos los participantes y las participantes y a los asistentes que nos sigan en el congreso, tanto presencialmente como virtualmente. También quiero aprovechar este momento para agradecer muy especialmente a Yaxlerra su acogida tan calurosa y tan generosa en el departamento y, bueno, y el haber tenido la predisposición para organizar este congreso juntos. Y también un agradecimiento muy especial a Gonzalo Díaz y a las moderadoras y moderadores que van seguro a hacer que el transcurso de este congreso, que será en estas circunstancias, pues que quizá hace que sea todo un poquito más complicado en los aspectos técnicos, pues seguro que van a hacer que todo se desarrolle muy bien. Entonces, antes de dar inicio al congreso, voy a lanzar un par de reflexiones sobre el tema que nos ocupará hoy y mañana, unas reflexiones muy generales para las que voy a tomar como pretexto el título del congreso, The Times of Pardon, Forgiveness, un poco para tratar de justificarlo, pero sobre todo para marcar un par de cuestiones generales antes de arrancar. En el título encontramos una barra entre Pardon y Forgiveness, que me parece que señala un punto en el que se concentra una importante problemática. Pardon, Forgiveness, si las leemos las dos en inglés, porque también podría leerse la primera en francés, pardon, como un guiño a Derrida, cuyos seminarios estarán seguramente muy presentes. Pardon, Forgiveness son entonces dos palabras que señalan ambas al perdonare latino. Pero aquí, desdoblándose, quizá muestren una doble vertiente del perdón, donde al menos una, la primera, pardon, queda muy arraigada a la figura de la soberanía y al acto soberano. Hasta donde sé, pardon, en inglés, remite no únicamente, pero sí específicamente, de un modo al menos diferente a como lo hace el término forgiveness, al perdón político, al indulto o al derecho de gracia que la Constitución otorga aquí, en Estados Unidos, como también en otros países, al presidente. A este derecho de gracia, a este pardon, Derrida lo define como el rasgo más político y jurídico del perdón, el lugar en el que el perdón aparece en el ámbito jurídico y político, pero apareciendo como interrupción de lo jurídico-político, fundando así el lugar de la excepcionalidad, de la excepción, de lo que se exceptúa de ese campo al mismo tiempo que figura en él como excepción posible. Una excepción que, como buena excepción, no tiene que ser justificada porque es discrecional. En este sentido, pardon, forgiveness derecho de gracia y perdón, aunque no quepa traducirlos así o distribuirlos de ese modo, en su diferencia, nos pueden ayudar a pensar un espacio compartido de exceso respecto al derecho, al orden jurídico. Ambos plantean una justicia más allá de la justicia. Sin embargo, el alcance de la gracia política es específicamente la remisión de la pena, mientras que el perdón parece aspirar a algo más o a otra cosa, quizá a algo que no puede ser fácilmente, soberanamente, reparado o redimido. Pardon, forgiveness, señalan así aquello que, excediendo el derecho, permite pensar tanto el ejercicio más soberano como otra instancia que quizá nunca quede del todo desarticulada del derecho y de la institución política. Esta relación entre el perdón y la soberanía, entre perdón y derecho, entre perdón y justicia, es quizá uno de los aspectos que puedan dar mucho sobre lo que pensar. Como decía que iba a referirme al título, me quedaría por decir algo sobre el tiempo o los tiempos del perdón. A finales de los años 90, y cabría preguntarse si esto ha cambiado, Derrida decía que no se podía abrir un periódico sin encontrar multitud de alusiones al perdón. Se refería a una continua exposición mediática de solicitudes de perdón o muestras de arrepentimiento por parte de actores públicos, políticos, en nombre propio, en nombre de gobiernos, iglesias, instituciones. Una comparecencia general de la conciencia humana planetaria ante la falta, decía Derrida. Señalaba esto como un rasgo de época inédito, incluso como una mutación en curso que resignificaba lo político, lo jurídico, las relaciones nacionales e internacionales y, en general, el lazo social. El perdón aparecía en el ámbito público como casi un mandamiento, una exigencia para el vivir juntos, una vía para afrontar situaciones de conflicto, de violencia y un modo también de afrontar cierto deber de memoria. En este marco, Derrida preguntaba con cierto asombro cómo podría explicarse que en el centro de las nuevas problemáticas globales, geopolíticas, nacionales, estatales, internacionales, la vieja noción de perdón, esa noción cargada de teologemas, permanezca aún como una herencia activa, significante y todavía útil. La significación del perdón permanece oscura, pero esto no parece ser impedimento para que al mismo tiempo parezca dominar el mundo entero. Esta oscuridad y a la vez esta herencia activa quizás sea otro de los grandes motivos por los que sea interesante interrogar esta noción de la que cabría pensar sus tiempos, su herencia espiritual, religiosa, filosófica, sus usos actuales y también los tiempos que conjuga, el tiempo de un pasado y de un porvenir, la alteridad de un pasado y de un futuro que fractura la plenitud de un presente, un pasado que no pasa o que se resista a pasar, o un porvenir como apertura a lo que esté por llegar. Bueno, con esto yo creo que ya podemos dar paso a la presentación de la primera ponente y dar ya por comenzado el congreso. Muchas gracias.
Entonces, I'm going to introduce Hagar Kotef. It is a real honor to introduce Professor Kotef. She's a professor of political theory in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of London. Her most recent book is The Colonizing Self, or Home and the Homeless in Israel-Palestine. This book examines the construction of political belonging in settler colonies. It came out in 2020 with Duke University Press and has received several awards, including the 2021 Yale Ferguson Award and honorable mentions in the Mesa Fatima Mernisi Award. I don't know how to say that, why you mispronounce it. Several awards, let's say. Her previous book, Movement and the Ordering of Freedom, Duke University Press 2015, charts the conceptual history of mobility and immobility in the history of political thought and the structuring of political spaces, from the writings of Locke, Hobbes, and Mill to the sophisticated technologies of control that circumscribe the lives of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Before joining the SOAS, Professor Kotef held positions and fellowships at the Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University,
the Department of Politics and Government at Ben Gurion University, Columbia University Society of Fellows, and the University of California, Berkeley. So please help me to welcome Professor Kotef with
Thank you so much, and also thank you, Idoia, for inviting me, and Jacques, I assume you're there as well, even though I don't see the audience. So thank you again for this very kind invitation. I'm not going to pretend that I understood the opening remark, even though Maria kindly translated some of them to me. So thank you, Maria. And so I apologize in advance if I fail to refer to them properly. I'm also not going to have a very traditional talk. I think rather I'm going to have a very, very long question or concern or perplexity that has been bothering me for a while now. And it's also not strictly about forgiveness. It's more about finding a place of understanding, perhaps. I'm still struggling with the words, and maybe this is something to discuss. It's not about preventing change or struggle, because perhaps, just perhaps, forgiveness is about living to the past, about moving on, right? About seeing the things we forgive as something that belongs to the past, right? As something that can be left behind, rather than something that keeps shaping the present, keep infiltrating into it or grumps into it. So this is not where I want to go, not at all. I actually want to refuse this very possibility of disentangling the past and the present, and to see the thing to which, as I said, we're not fully forgive, but which we try to understand as something that keeps structure and keep lingers within the present. And so where I want to end today is with a book talk I recently gave, in which I was asked to reflect upon some ethical dilemma I had in writing the book, in writing the Colonizing Self. And in my reflection, I introduced this possibility of understanding, and understanding also the agents of violence, the violence we want to undo and we want to criticize. And this reflection arose quite a few rejections, a shock, if not anger. And it is this shock or these reactions on which I want to reflect. But I cannot really do it without introducing a bit, at least, of the book. And so my talk today will have three parts. In the first, I'm going to share with you a small excerpt from the book that talks about settler violence in the West Bank and about its normalization. And I want to talk about normalization because I want precisely to try to find, or to ask whether we can find, a way of, let's call it for now, understanding that does not fall into this trap of normalization. So if normalization is about preventing change, I want to think of a model of understanding that is all about facilitating change. Basically, the dilemma I want or the dilemma I would like to surface in relation to this expert from that book talk is whether we can keep our critical edge, our political alliances, but still find a place within us for compassion. But I'm ahead of myself. So in the second part of the talk, I'm going to present this ethical dilemma and the reactions that it received when I presented it. And then at the very last bit of the talk, I'm going to try and reflect on these through the notion of forgiveness in order to bring it home, if you'd like. So since ultimately I want to think about this relation between the particular mode of forgiveness or understanding or compassion or attentiveness, again, we need to find a word for that. So to differentiate that from acceptance or normalization, I want to start with the question of normalization. And basically, my question is going to be, how is apartheid normalized? How does one get accustomed, indifferent, even approving of a reality of land theft and occupation? And there are many ways to approach this question, many ways to approach an answer. So as one possible way in, I want to share with you a bit from the 7th season of the Israeli franchise of the reality show MasterChef, which aired in 2017. One of the main candidates of this season was Yoya Izri, a settler from Amona, which was evicted only 4 months before the show was shot. The story of the show, which I shall only fragmentally unfold here, is the story of Amona's normalization, its final acceptance into the Israeli mainstream. It is thus both a particular piece of in the puzzle, which is the answer for my question, and an allegory for the whole. So Amona was an isolated outpost in the middle of the West Bank. I'm not sure in this audience, and I cannot see your faces, so I don't know if I need to explain the difference between settlement and an outpost, but maybe I will just say very quickly that even though all settlements are illegal according to international law, the Israeli government does see as legal some settlements, as long as they're built according to particular regulations. But some it does not see as legal. And these are the outposts. Usually they're built on privately owned Palestinian land, usually by individual people rather than the government, though all these differentiations should be problematized. But anyway, Amona was an isolated outpost, which was founded in 1995. 1997, the Israeli government issued a decree for its eviction and demolition, which the Israeli government was very reluctant to follow. So even though the government saw this settlement, this outpost as illegal, even though it issued over the years quite a few decrees for its demolition, it tried to do whatever it can in order to not evict Amona. Yet a very rare combination of circumstances led to a decision by the Supreme Court to accept the appeal of the 3 villages, the 3 Palestinian villages on which Amona was built, on whose lands Amona was built, which are Silwad, En Yarbud, and Taibe. And so the Israeli Supreme Court has forced the government to evict Amona, and the eviction took place in 2 stages. Once in 2006, when 9 of its houses were demolished, and one in 2017, when the entire settlement was clear. Now, in the 2006 demolition, there were more casualties than in the entire eviction of the entire Gaza Strip 1 year earlier, in 2005. There was a dozen of people, both settlers and security forces, who ended up in hospital. There was a parliamentary inquiry committee, and there was a traumatic memory of what looked like or was constructed to seem like the verge of a civil war. But following this eviction, the settlers, and following the disengagement from Gaza, the eviction of all settlements in the Gaza Strip, the settlers learned a very important lesson. They learned that if they are to prevent the next eviction, they need to settle in the heart, this is how they called it, settling in the heart of the entire Israeli public. And this is where MasterChef enters into the picture. So recall, we are with Yoya Izri from Amona, one of the main candidates of the season, and also one of the first settlers in Amona, and a leading figure in the struggle against its eviction. Now, Izri was the last candidate in the first episode. Now, if you've ever watched MasterChef, you know that the first episode or 2 is like an audition episode, which basically means that you have dozens of candidates. They all cook a certain version of a particular dish. In this case, it was a pita bread, and we can talk about that later and its meaning. And then the judges taste it anonymously, and then they invite the best cooks into a room where they sit as well. There are four of the most famous chefs in Israel. And in that room, the candidate, the finalists, can cook a dish of their choice. So Nizri was the last candidate in this audition episode. And when one of the judges tasted the pita bread he made, he assumed he's a woman, a mother, and practically talked about how he can taste the mother's care for her many children in that pita bread, and how he can see a unity of an entire family assembling around this pita. But the second Nizri enters into the room, this unity is broken. The unity becomes a conflict and otherness in a way. And to tell you already now, the end of the story, the conflict and otherness would be resolved. The few minutes in which the judges learn to know Nizri in this episode encapsulate the process both them and the viewers at home are to go through during the entire season, which is this resolution of conflict. Now, the chef and judge, Eyal Shani, is the main adversary in this conflict. So there is Nizri on the other side and Eyal Shani on Nizri on one side, Eyal Shani on the other side. And Eyal Shani represents here a kind of a left-ish Israeli perspective that is going to be remolded through the episode and the entire season. So when Nizri steps into the room, he immediately asks him with quite a lot of disdain about his very large yarmulke. And just in case the viewers miss the disdain, he snorts when Nizri says his name. And this name, you should know, is a very particular Jewish name that is very specific to a group or a cohort, which is primarily settler religious cohort. And then another judge, Michal Ansky, who is the only woman among the judges, asks Nizri where he's from. Until 4 months ago, he says, I was from Amona. And then she asks, were you among those evicted, marking Nizri as a victim? But Shani refuses her definition and interrupts her. You're a settler, he says to Nizri quite harshly. Ansky, who I said is the only woman among the judges, stereotypically keeps urging everyone to put politics aside in the name of unity obtained through food. But this effort to steer clear of politics is futile, a futility that makes it the most successful strategy of the normalization of settlements. The personal household cannot be extricated from its political settings. Its very existence is the political action. By merely living in his home, Nizri stole land. His very homemaking is occupation. Now, much later in the season, Nadia, a Palestinian candidate from Jerusalem, reminds him of this. She mentions that Nizri had taken her for a tour in Greater Palestine, and he immediately corrects her, Greater Israel. She talks about how he showed her, and I quote, all the settlements, all that they stole from me, where our fathers were born and raised, he corrects her again. Our fathers who gave us the right to be here. Really, really, she responds. But beyond this very short moment, Nizri would not be held accountable for this robbery of lands. And the only pain we will see is his own pain, the outcome of a traumatic house demolition. This is even though the vast majority, the overwhelmingly vast majority of houses and of house demolitions in the Greater Israel or in Greater Palestine, that is between the sea and the river, the vast majority of these demolitions are demolitions of Palestinian homes. But we're not going to see those at all. Decontextualization is an important element of normalization. The ongoing failure of separating home from politics in this case is what allows politics to be folded into the personal and the intimate, right? What allows settlement to become a home. And this is what allows settlement to become normalized and more acceptable. And this is perhaps most evident when Shani's accusation, you're a settler, which is political in its terminology, is transformed into an individualized accusation concerning parental responsibility. And I quote him, "You know," he tells to Nizri, "you live on a very fragile ground. You're responsible for 8 children, and you build a home for them that can also be torn down. Do you see yourself as a responsible father?" End quote. "Yes, I am a responsible father," Nizri declares immediately. And he continues, and I quote, "Without venturing into politics," and Shani immediately interrupts, "as a family man," Nizri takes upon himself Shani's words, and I continue quoting him, "Life in Israel, life in Judea and Samaria," which is the Jewish Israeli way of talking about the West Bank. So life in Judea and Samaria is not a political matter. It is a matter of life. 400,000 people live there. No one is going to evict them. This is not a question." End quote. So the question of settlement has been settled, right? Eviction is not an option and can thus be declared as not political. When Nizri describes his not political home, he mostly laments his large kitchen. The kitchen opens the possibility of re-articulating occupation in colors that appeal to all the judges and presumably the viewers at home as well. Through describing that kitchen that is lost, a transition is made in the discussion, shifting from denunciation to a discourse of loss and pain. The kitchen is no longer there. After the eviction, Nizri and his family were moved to a youth hostel when there is no kitchen at all. Only, Nizri tells us, one sink in which one both brushes their teeth and makes sandwiches. Loss of the possibility to cook seems to bring everyone closer. At this point, both the audition and the episode are brought to an end. The Nizri's family is invited to enter the room, and this is the only family, this is the only candidate whose family is brought in, right, to the episode, to the discussion. They join the judges, is singing, and the final images of the episode are of the judges hugging the Nizri family members. And again, none of the other candidates has received any physical affection whatsoever. Ansky's final words recapitulate the trajectory of the conversation and its message, and I quote her, "I may be far away from you in my political views and geographically, but I feel close to you because I felt a Shabbat dinner at your home." A Shabbat dinner was Nizri's dish of choice for the audition. This is the ultimate Israeli symbol of home, and he indeed declares that this is the dinner he used to prepare at home, the home that was. But reminiscing the destruction of that home, which is no longer there, is not to abandon the settlement project. The dinner includes herbs, as he tells us, from the Judea mountains in the West Bank, and his own wine made in the vineyards that still stand firm, he tells us, in the lands of Ammona. And I should say that the vineyards were the object of quite a lot of contestation in the Supreme Court ruling because of a glitch in which the Ammona settlers insisted that the appeal of the Palestinian villages was against the houses of the settlement, but not against the agricultural lands. And so the Supreme Court eventually accepted their claim and ordered the eviction of the houses, but allowed the agricultural areas to still stand there, right? So the wine is being brought to the dinner table. Ammona becomes present as a tragedy, as a legitimate home, in the living rooms of the Israeli households watching the show. Now, Nizri would become one of the judges' favorite as the show continues and would indeed settle in the hearts of many households. His settlement project would be transformed from something for which someone is being accused, right? You are settlers in the beginning, to a quality that finds its products also in cooking. So at the semi-final, the candidates are asked to replicate a very famous dessert of a very famous Israeli chef called Jerusalem. And this dessert has small mountains for marzipan and olive trees that are olive oil candies and stones made of chocolate. And then in the middle, a giant frozen ball made of white chocolate mousse, which stands for the Dome of the Rock. As soon as she tastes his creation, Ansky says that she can savor the soil, the land, the roots in Nizri's dessert, right? Like all the tropes of settlement, perhaps. And Shani reflects on the quiet, solid connection to the land that can be tasted in Nizri's cooking. At that point, Nizri cannot stop his tears. He tells the judges about how, when he arranged the plate, he imagined the roads leading from Amona to Jerusalem, the mountains seen from his home that is no longer there. And I quote him, "A ruin that still exists, my home that is being destroyed," and he talks in the present tense, the temple that is being destroyed, again in the present tense. "And I want to rebuild it. I miss the land," he later says. "I miss my home, the feeling of stability. Now everything is destroyed," end quote. His voice cracks, the background music, the sympathetic looks on the judge's face make it easy to sense his grief. But Nizri's dessert is missing something. It has no Dome of the Rock. When Nizri tried to build this very intricate, delicate dessert, it simply exploded. Nizri was alarmed for a moment, but then shrugged his shoulders and said, "I do not really need that Dome of the Rock anyway. We want to see the Jewish temple built there instead," right, as he said before. Nizri expresses here, in and through a dessert that had failed, but that succeeded beyond expectations, a fantasy of the Jewish extreme right to detonate the Muslim holy site located where the temple once stood and rebuild the temple instead. Nevertheless, this small-scale culinary version of what would bring to an unprecedented regional war, if it were to happen in reality, passes without much attention. It doesn't seem to remind anyone of all the homes which have been destroyed as a result of the construction of Nizri's home. Only one of the judges finds it important to comment on this absence. "I wonder what Freud would have said about this omission," he laughs. Now, 4 months after the show aired, Nizri, alongside a few other families, moved to a new home the Israeli government built for them, a new settlement deep in the eastern part of the West Bank. During the same time, the full legal implications of Amona's eviction have been learned, and the government passed the Judea and Samaria Settlement Regulation Law, which retroactively grants land use rights to settlement built on Palestinian land. So it basically legalizes all the outposts. There will be no more Amona, that is, no more evictions. Okay, so until here, the part from the book, I want to move away from it now to the second and third parts of the doc, which are going to be much shorter. And to reflect about this, the ethical dilemma I mentioned before. So seemingly what we see here is quite simple, right? We see the ability of Israelis to lament and to see the loss of other Israelis. And how this is done in tandem with, or maybe how it is conditioned by, the erasure of the loss of Palestinians' home. And normalization takes place in this tension, right? In this space between erasure and lamenting. But as I was writing this chapter, it was important for me not to replicate the same duality from the opposite perspective. So even though I wanted to write and emphasize the loss of Palestinians' home and their dispossession, it was important for me not to erase the loss of Jewish Israelis, even settlers' homes. Now, it's really easy for someone like me with my set of political beliefs and what I know to simply be against someone like Nizri. Because for reasons I only began to explain, and maybe we will return to them later, to more of them later, I think Amona, like all other outposts and all other settlements, must be evicted. Yet, I wanted to open, right, a possibility of relating to that loss, of relationality, which meant that in order to write this chapter, I watched quite a lot of YouTube videos of the eviction. Now, it's not a straightforward choice, and we can talk about this as well, but it was important for me as part, right, of the effort to see the pain and loss embedded also in this destruction of home. And indeed, I should say that it was only when I watched these videos that I could see the pain and loss. Before that, it was very easy to imagine them away and out of the picture. In those videos, I saw homes that were evidently rooted in violence. And to see this violence, one does not need to have any previous knowledge of the theft of the land, the lies involved to justify it, the acts of violence toward neighboring Palestinians, and we can talk about all this as well. It is enough to look at the house's walls sprayed with slogans such as "Death to all Arabs" to see this violence clearly, to see the hate, to see the racism. And still, the pain of the evicted people is there as well. As they lie on the ground, hug it, holding on to whatever they can, as they are forcibly carried away by security forces, or as they turn their bodies into passive heavyweights, letting police officers lift them up and carry them outside their home, resisting without resistance, refusing to leave, yet accepting to be moved. Or as they stand outside their homes, looking at the bulldozers, demolishing everything that they have built, everything that has been them for so long. Even though these people lost only what they stole, even though much of this was an orchestrated spectacle whose participants often came from the outside, so they were not really settlers from Amona, and they were just coming there in order to create, right, this facade of civil war or pain in order to prevent the next possible eviction. There is still loss there. And this loss is impossible to dismiss, but also impossible to contain alongside all that I know about the history, geography, and politics of that place. From the left, the images of the evictions are so difficult to process, not because they show the injustice done to settlers, but because they show precisely how justice itself hurts others so much. It is impossible to hold on to the pain while simultaneously recognizing that it is necessary. To share the grief of anyone who is uprooted, but understand that these people cannot stay where they are. Maybe I should say something about what they cannot stay where they are. How am I doing on time? I did not. How much time do I still have?
How much does it?
She's fine. You have
Plenty.
yeah.
Okay, good. So no matter how we look at the desired solution in that, settlements make it impossible. So if we think about the possibility of separation to two states, right, two-state solution, then the location of the settlements all throughout, right, paved throughout the West Bank, make any separation impossible. They just make the land undividable. But also if we think about a one-state solution, the very architecture and topography of settlements make any just solution impossible because they are all situated on the hilltop, right, creating some form of hierarchical domination. They establish what Eyal Weizmann called visual control. They make sure that water sources are in the control of Israelis. Their sewage often spilled into Palestinian land and agricultural territories. So no matter how we look at it, they cannot just be there as part of a just solution. Anyway, in that book talk with which I began and to which I now want to return, it was important for me to talk also about that pain, even though, again, I want to emphasize it, even though I think, right, the settlement had to be evicted. It was important for me to find a place in myself that is empathetic also to that loss. And I wanted to do it in a way that does not erase or normalizes all the injustice that is woven into the existence of the settlements. So not in the same way as was done in MasterChef, for example. It is not about forgiving in a way and foregoing all that has been done in the name of this settlement and by it. It is also not about claiming that the fact that these are the homes of some people, violent and just home, but home nonetheless. It's not claiming that the fact that this is homes, that these are homes, should mean that these homes must be protected or that the loss must be compensated, etc., etc. But it is an attempt to see that despite all of the above, and as part of recognizing all of the above, these people lost their home too. And yet the second I allowed this loss to surface, I was encountered, as I said, by shock, if not anger. People seem to have found it difficult to accept the very ethical dilemma that I introduced. Not my answer to it, because I did not have an answer to it. Just my very question. Could we see a loss there too? And what happens if and when we see it? And in the time that I have, I want to reflect on this shock for a second. Why is it so disturbing to pose the question? Is it because the ambivalence embedded into justice is so disturbing? Is it because we want to keep a pure concept of justice? I don't think I have an answer, but as a way of concluding, I want to try to map the different discourses at stake. So we have forgiveness as a certain break from the order of the law, or a certain break from history, or the logic of calculation or consequences. It is about taking us into an altogether different political path, where the past and the future are linked in radically different ways. And I said from the outset, and I want to say again, this is not where I want to go. Moreover, I think it's important to say that it is not my path to go on, even if I wanted. It is not up for me to forgive or not to forgive people like Nizri, since I am not the subject of the wrongs, right? So this would be something for a Palestinian to judge. And yet this conference opens the question of forgiveness also in order to allow us to rethink the structure of right and justice in relation to politics. And I do want to stay there for a moment. It seems to me that for an effective political change, we need to understand the mechanisms that allow oppression and violence to persist. And it seems to me that these mechanisms operate on at least 3 levels, and each is important. So the first is the legal order, and here we would talk about institutions and citizenship and democratization and equality. The second is the material one, which has to do with how resources are allocated, how space is organized, how access is granted, and much more. And the last is affectual and has to do with the form of attachment of people to various social orders, as well as their attachment and disattachment to other people, to other communities, and to places. And my reluctantness to go all the way, as it were, into the notion of forgiveness is, I think, my refusal, at least in this particular context, to move beyond the first 2 discourses. That is, I think that the legal and the material discourses of rights and of distribution must be insisted on. But I'm left wondering how we negotiate them with a third layer, the affective layer. Because if indeed political change requires a shift in modes of attachment, and I think this is a claim I want to foreground, that this is in a way the claim of the book as a whole, then we must first be able to understand the affectual mechanisms that produce them. And in order to understand, we need to open a space of relationality that often requires a suspension of judgment, a cordoning off, even if only for a moment, of the complete and final denunciation. And this is the case even if, and perhaps precisely when, we seek to engage in projects of justice. to undo oppression and other exploitative power structures, we need first to understand how they work, what allows their sustainment and prolongation. We need to understand what render people attached to them. And if I just, to put it bluntly and briefly, if we are to undo the settlement project, we need to understand what renders a mona, a home for some people. Now, is there a fear that if we understand, we will also accept, even forgive? Is this what stood at the background of this shock and anger? But if so, is it a sign that the discourse of morality and justice somehow shifted? So when Arendt, for example, writes Eichmann in Jerusalem, she saw Eichmann as blamable, mostly because he failed to see from the point of view of the other. But it seems to me that the turn the discourse of justice has taken in the last several years entail the explicit refusal of such modes of seeing from the point of view of some others. In a way, at least, I think this is the essence of what had gained the name cancel politics. And this is why my ethical dilemma avoids so many objections. But can there be a politics of justice, a creation of movement, of change, of effective action, without this ability to shift positions, without this ability to open up to another? Now, I don't know what I think of the answer here, and I don't have an answer precisely because the very object of my critique was such a shifting of position, only the other way around, right, in the other direction. What I wanted to criticize in the project of normalization was the judges and the audience of MasterChef moving, right, from condemnation to understanding and acceptance. So is there a way out of this vicious circle? Is there a particular politics of understanding, a particular mode of openness, of willingness to listen that can bypass this impulse? I'm not sure, but here's a suggestion, and this is where I conclude. Normalization seeks to stabilize, to put an end to the question, to seal and preclude the possibility of interruption, to depoliticize, as we saw in Israel's word. But in a way, so are some performances of justice, some modes of justice discourse that seek to put an end to the very possibility to ask. What I'm looking for is a politics, one that truly keeps orienting itself towards justice, but a politics above everything else, that does the opposite. The opposite both of normalization and this very particular discourse of justice, right? That keeps the questions open, that summons movement and disruption, that open up spaces for political action, right? It is this mode of shifting I am interested in. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kotef. That was a very interesting presentation, and I am just going to moderate the questions that I am sure will be coming. Since we have more people online, I think it will be pertinent to ask people online if they have questions, and if they do, please just, you can either raise your hand or nos escuchan muy bien. Okay. Well, can click on my mouse.
A ver si se escucha mejor ahora. So we hope that now you can hear me. Lisa Espinosa says yes. Yeah, you know, this thing, it doesn't work. My voice is very mild. Thank you so much, Professor Kotef. That was the core of what I wanted to say. And now we have to leave room for questions. And since we have more people online, we are going to start by giving the opportunity to the people that is on Zoom to raise a question. Okay, the master, yeah. So if you have a question, please just jump in. You can open your microphone, raise your hand, do whatever you feel more comfortable doing, and we are going to moderate the questions. We have plenty of time, so feel comfortable asking whatever you want.
Maria has a question.
María. Adelante, por favor.
Gracias, Paula. Thank you, Hagar, for your talk, which is very inspiring. I also have to say the image, example, instantiation with which you open has been so helpful in order to develop what you want to say. I find that way of theorizing really, really inspiring. So thank you so much for that. I guess more than questions, I have reactions, maybe not yet questions. I think I will have questions for you in the future, but I need to think about them. But I wanted to talk about the kind of affect that you are putting forward and asking about, because all of the sides of what you've presented to us awake certain affects, right? And the affect that is needed for normalization, I think, is the one that you have perfectly illustrated with your example. And we could also talk about the kind of affects that are awakened by, like, the spectacle of justice, I will call it, as that other side of what you say you want to take distance from that spectacle of justice and those kind of affects, and the affect that is required for the kind of normalization that you were presenting. But then there is this, let's say, third side that you want to open, which is a kind of politics that maybe let's not call it a politics of forgiveness, although we could redefine forgiveness in ways that could go together with what you're saying. But this place where, and you said compassion is still possible, but we still, and you said we need suspension of judgment, but you also said where we should be still able to defend our alliances, to defend what we think is right. So it's not entirely a suspension of judgment either, because we need to hold all those things at the same time. Maybe it is impossible. And that's, I think, the question behind your. So I would like to know a little bit more about the sort of affects in connection to that notion of compassion that you're bringing in as an important element of that third side, because compassion is a very, problematic word too in this context. And I very much share with you all the dilemmas. I'm going to be speaking kind of about that tomorrow, although in Spanish. So, but we'll be able to talk about it at another time. But yes, this is maybe my first reaction or sort of question for you. And thank you so much for that talk and for sharing with us your work.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think it's an excellent question, not just because you summarized so well what I was trying to do, but also because you forced me to speak about the thing I cannot really speak, right? Because I don't know, right? The reason, the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is that I think what was important for me to theorize as part of this project is the first set of attachments. Because I think they're under-theorized, right? Because I think we have, especially in political theory, we have a set of approaches to think about perpetrators, or beneficiaries, right? Like this arch of the people who are either actively or passively involved in projects of injustice, of dispossession, right, of violence, anything from genocide to gentrification. And I think that if we think effectively, right, there are three sets of affects that circulate in the theory. One is a certain mode of enjoying, of taking pleasure in violence, which I think is important. But I think enough people have written about it, so I was less interested in that. The other, we can call it something like an unstable attachment to authority, for example. This is like the Frankfurt School people, right? Who keep asking about the psychological and affectual and attachmentive mechanisms that make people obedient. And then I think the vast majority of people who talk, certainly in post-colonial theory, if they talk about modes like affective politics of perpetrators or beneficiaries, they mostly see them as people who cannot sustain their own violence. So they mostly talk about disattachment, right? And they talk about like the very convoluted psychological and epistemological mechanisms that make people not to see, ignore, go elsewhere, not understand, da. And I think this misses something really important. And in this sense, Nizri is a clear example. But in the book, I actually try to make very similar argument in regard to Jews, right, who inherited depopulated Palestinian homes in Jaffa or Jerusalem, right? People whose engagement with actual direct disposition is not as clear-cut as what we see there. And part of what I want to try is to show that these people, which is basically my people, right, become attached and invested in this project. We can call it Zionism, we can call it settler colonialism, we can call it dispossession, we can call it violence, we can call it by many names. Apartheid was a name I used here. They become effectively invested in it. And the affect is different in these different positions, right? So if someone is a settler, and alongside Nizri, I talk about another figure of a settler who is actually a very active perpetrator. So he walks around the field with like a machine gun. And he actually almost single-handedly evicted an entire Palestinian village, right? So there is a huge spectrum from the most violent settler to the most liberal leftist Jewish Israeli in Tel Aviv, who are invested very differently and yet all invested in that same project. And it was important for me, right, to look at this mechanism of attachment. So this first bit, I feel now very, very able to theorize and understand. And I also feel very able to theorize and understand the second one, right? What you call the spectacle of justice, right? This refusal, right? This sharp divide, we can call it a sharp divide in attachment, in which you declare the group to which you are attached, right? The group of which you're an ally, and then refuse a complete, right? And then engage in a complete negation of that other group, right? So I'm pro-Palestinian, so I'm against Israelis. I'm pro-Me Too, so I hate all men. Of course, this is of course an oversimplification. In the case of Me Too, I'm not sure these days it's an oversimplification in the case of Palestinian and Israelis as well. I think it became more and more of a thing that if you're for this side, you have to engage in a complete, either active hatred or a complete disattachment of the other side. So we see it in many cases. My daughter is going through like a gender transition at the moment, so she really like would not see or talk with straight people because they became the thing that cannot be, right, sustained. So this is the second part you talked about, and then you asked me about the third, right, the in-between. And the in-between is what I don't know, right? It's what I think is so necessary, right? And in all these domains, right? And I think it's necessary precisely if we want to have meaningful alliances. I think we cannot have a successful political struggle if we keep engaging in alienating other people. And yet I don't know how to do this, right? So you're very right about pointing to this like black hole in my theory, but I think this is the black hole that we must like delve into and find in it the solution. Sergio, do you want to just jump in?
Yes, I wanted, because I don't think it's a black hole in your theory, but it's exactly the most important issue we have today. When you say precisely that you are looking for a politic of justice, I was wondering, after your presentation, what will be the nature of that politics? Let alone that we don't even know what justice means in this context, right? So it's a very problematic situation, no? I was thinking at the same time in the Mapuche problems in Chile, where we have a sort of brutal, similarity with the settled colonialism in Palestinian territory, but with different mechanisms. But at the same time, I was thinking in the way you split the institutional, the material, and the affective level. And I was wondering whether you reduce politics to just the last one of them or to all of them, right? On one hand, and on the other hand, it is true that depoliticization could be a process of neutralization, naturalization of violence, but also, and I think that you end up there, hyperpoliticization could be also precisely a naturalization of violence, in the sense that hyperpoliticization could produce the reenactment of this friend's enemy narrative that produce a notion of justice reduced to the logic of equivalence and to the logic of restitution. And this is, one of the biggest problems today in what they call transitional justice. They believe that the only way to get rid of conflict is somehow to fall into the logic of restitution. So, I think you will agree with me that a politic of justice, which is no more, no less than a politics open to the question of justice, therefore, not just to the logic of equivalence, could not be reduced to the logic of restitution, recognition, and so on. It's always still tentative, but it's always more than that.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think this is where, and I really like your formulation of a politics of justice as a politics that must keep the question of justice open, right? And I guess this is part of, it's a much better way of formulating my discomfort with this performance of justice, or this politics of justice that just wants to settle things once and for all, because it seems to me that settlement is itself a form of injustice. But I think in this context, some of the element of what a politics of justice would look like are very easy for me to articulate, right? So if we think about the three layers, it seems that in the legal layer, we need formal equality. It seems to me like as the basic condition for any justice, right? You cannot have justice without equality. So we need to have a democratic state, or if one wants two democratic states, I don't see it as a viable option at the moment, but this is a historical problem and not like a problem of justice. So whatever constellation of state you may have, it needs to be democratic and it needs to be equal, so that everyone is equal towards the law. So there cannot be occupation and there cannot be apartheid, right? So this is, I think this is a basic condition, but it too is not sufficient, right? So, which is where we go to the material. So we need a material redistribution of all the stolen resources. Now, how this looks like, here I'm less sure, right? So because after time passes, let's think about the US as an example, right? After enough time passes, to re-give indigenous land to all indigenous people would be to displace so many other people. Some of them came to the US without any fault or settler rights. Some of them were brought there as slaves and found a piece of land eventually, right? And so how does one redistribute without causing more justice? I don't know, but I think this is one thing we need to keep open, but I think we must account for the fact that this is a necessary element. And then with the last layer, I'm even less sure, right? So, and I think the last layer is not necessary as a goal right? So it's not what we need to arrive at. It's not that I think there is a prescription of affection that we need to arrive at in order to have justice, but I think it's a precondition, right? I think we want to be able to have like a proper democratic state, and we want to be able to engage in a politics of redistribution that is just and that people perceive as just, without first attending, I'm not sure about the first, without also attending, right, to how people relate to each other, right? So people must see in each other their equals and not just be told by the law that they're equals to each other, for example, right? This would be part of this project of justice. Yes, this is all to say in a prolonged way that I completely agree with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotef. I don't know if Sergio has a follow-up question or if we have more questions from the Zoom group.
Well, I just emphasize that I totally agree with not forgetting the material redistribution of property, which is crucial, but at the same time emphasizing that it is never enough. And that's exactly why I keep open a politic of justice as something to come, something that cannot be just fixed with, you know, a new welfare state or a new centralized distribution policy, indeed.
If you allow me to jump in, another thing that I thought that was very interesting about Professor Kotef's answer is that on the one hand, she recognizes the need of acknowledging each other and see each other as equals, but I don't think we can also suppress the process of singularization that attach people with certain groups, right? We can, yeah, so somehow making things equal also erases a level of singularity that it is precisely that to which justice has to be open in order to continue actualizing itself. Yeah, that's my just. I just made abuse of my moderator position. More questions? No? And do we have any questions from the people here in Riverside, physically here?
If there are questions, you can write your questions in the chat.
Yeah, if you have questions in Spanish, we can also provide for translation or interpretation. If you want to say your question in Spanish, I can interpret to my best ability. Am I loud? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kotef. I think we don't have more questions for now, but your talk has definitely set the direction for a very what seems to be a very ambitious and stimulating discussion, and I look forward to see how these things carry through from paper to paper. Right now, we are going to. Where are we going? Huh? Okay, he's going to say the goodbyes. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So we are here this first block of this international conference at UCR Hispanic Studies to take a lunch break. And we will be back at 3 p.m. PST California time for a wonderful block with lectures by Jack Lesla, Tyler and Williams, and Peggy Cano. So see you in a bit in this same Zoom meeting room from those who attend remotely.